Woody Harrelson has played in so many great roles, and I feel like depending on your age and a few other things, you might not fully recognize him as some of the same characters that someone else might. I'm practically a sperm cell, and as embarrassing as it is to say, the first movie that I saw him in was The Hunger Games when I was like 8, and ever since then it's become clearer every day that he is the only relatable character in that series. Now I appreciate him for his part in things like No Country, Natural Born Killers, True Detective, The First Zombieland, Of Course White Men Can't Jump, and I also liked him in Highwaymen. Oddly enough, as interesting as his story may be, I don't know, I haven't really looked into him, there's someone who has him beat, and it just so happens to be his own father. And I have looked into him. In fact, I've spent the last 3.5 packs of American Spirits and 4 pints of Smirnoff looking into him. This is the story of Woody Harrelson's father, Charles Harrelson. Charles Void Harrelson was born July 23, 1938 in Lovelady, Texas. His father, Void, was a farmer and later on a prison guard, and his mother's name was Alma Lee Harrelson, formerly Alma Lee Sparks. I couldn't find much more on his parents or his childhood except that a lot of his family was in law enforcement, and apparently he was president of the poster club at his school, Huntsville High School. He dropped out and joined the Navy as soon as he was old enough, and he was a sonar man, somewhere around 1955, but that's sort of a guesstimate since there's no definitive date anywhere online. He didn't last long in the Navy because he couldn't really manage to behave himself, and after being discharged, Charles would move to California and hold a vast variety of different jobs, like repairing dental equipment, being an encyclopedia salesman, and even a professional gambler, the latter of which being his favorite. In February of '58, Charles married Diane Lou Oswald in Pasadena, Texas. The couple would move to Houston and have 3 children, Jordan Kenneth Harrelson, Woodrow Tracy Harrelson, and Brett V. Harrelson, before they would eventually get divorced in 1964. The jobs I previously mentioned were not the only things Charles had going on. His short time in the Navy showed that he had an affinity for doing illegal things and getting into trouble. He was arrested for the first time at 21 and subsequently throughout the early 60s was involved in multiple robberies, with his first major conviction coming in 1960. On top of the robberies, Charles had decided to pursue another career path as he was in deep with gambling debt and needed another way to make some money. This career path was murder for hire, and in 1968, his new business began operation. That year, a carpet salesman by the name of Alan Berg disappeared and was later found shot in the head and strangled. Alan's brother David Berg wrote a book on the murder titled Run, Brother, Run, and in it, he says that none other than Charles Harrelson kidnapped Alan, shot him in the head, and then proceeded to strangle his lifeless corpse for good measure after being paid $1,500 by one of Berg's business rivals. He also writes about the failure of the justice system to actually convict Harrelson since he was acquitted of the murder by a jury in 1970. The year 1968 was significant not only because of Charles' first alleged murder and the start of his new business venture, but it was also the end of his relationship with his family. That year, he left his wife Diane, his son Woody, and his 2 brothers for a full-time life of crime, gambling, and violence. Woody would lose track of his dad until around 1981, but we'll circle back to that later. Also in 1968, Charles would be approached by a man named Peter Scamardo who ran a grain business. Aside from the grain business, he also smuggled heroin. And during one of his smuggling operations, something went wrong and he had lost faith in one of his business partners. Peter paid Charles $2,000, which is the equivalent of about 18,000 USD today, to kill a man named Sam DeGalia. On July 6th of that year, DeGalia was found shot to death and Charles was arrested for the murder. He was able to get a hung jury at first after lawyering up heavy and pulling some shady stuff with an alleged alibi, but his luck would run out come 1970. Charles and his big shot lawyer's alibi scheme pretty much fell apart during the retrial, and subsequently Charles was given 15 years. Harrelson would end up being released after 5 years on good behavior in 1978. After getting out, it was right back to business for Charles. He hooked himself up with a man named Jimmy Chagra, who was a member of a group called the Dixie Mafia. The Dixie Mafia was a criminal organization operating primarily in the South around this time. Chagra was on trial for trafficking in 1979 and got possibly the worst hand dealt that he could have gotten when it comes to judges. The judge presiding over his case was Judge John H. Wood Jr., and he did not go lightly when it came to sentencing. He was so harsh with handing out hard time that he earned the nickname Maximum John. He was also known for being particularly hard on drug traffickers, and Jimmy Chagra wanted him gone. He wanted him gone so much that he paid Charles Harrelson $250,000, which is worth over $1 million today, to whack Maximum John. On May 29, 1979, Judge Wood noticed a flat tire as he came out to the car to leave for work. As he stood by his driver's side door, Charles Harrelson would emerge from behind him with a Weatherby hunting rifle and put a bullet in the middle of Wood's lower back. Judge Maximum John H. Wood would die on the way to the hospital, marking the first murder of a federal judge in the entire 20th century. Harrelson also had a side of substance abuse issues to go along with his main course of gambling addiction, and it seems like the paranoia of killing a fucking federal judge may have got to him a little bit. He did go a little bit overboard with the booger sugar, and obviously the cops were all over this. With the help of an anonymous tip and a recorded conversation between Jimmy Chagra and his brother Joe in prison, police were able to identify Charles, and after a 3-year manhunt, they managed to find and arrest him. This did not come before a 6-hour-long cocaine-fueled standoff between Harrelson and the arresting agent, where he made the shocking, if questionable, admission of his role in the killing of President John F. Kennedy. Charles Harrelson was tried and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murder of Judge Wood, despite claiming he only took credit for the murder so he could get the money from Chagra. His wife at the time, Joanne Harrelson, was also arrested since she bought him the Weatherby hunting rifle used in the murder. He ended up remarrying a few times throughout his life, but Diane Oswald and Joanne are really the only 2 worth mentioning for me right now. The funniest part about the whole trial is that the man who ordered the hit to help with his trial, Jimmy Chagra, actually ended up being acquitted. This is where Charles' son, Woodrow Woody Harrelson, comes back into the fold. Whether you know him from killing zombies with Barbie Boy, or from being naturally born to kill, or even from being the only character you could relate to in the Hunger Games. In 1981, he was just a normal student in Hanover College in Indiana, and since Charles abandoned his family in 1968, Woody knew not a thing about his dad or his criminal past, since his dad had never been a part of his life, let alone his upbringing. That was until Woody heard about a man accused of murdering a federal judge in Texas while listening to the news on the radio. When he heard the man's name, Charles Harrelson, he went to his mother for confirmation, which she gave. Woody would actually end up following his father's trial and end up forming a complicated but friendly relationship with him while he was behind bars. He tried his best to get his father a retrial and claimed he believed his dad was innocent. I don't really want to get into all that, as this video is more about the life of his father, but Woody talks about it a few times in interviews himself. Obviously, it's hard for Woody to view this man as a real father figure since he was never there for him and abandoned him. Oh, and apparently there's a possibility that Charles is also Matthew McConaughey's dad, but I'm skeptical. Sometime after his imprisonment in 1995, Charles was actually involved in an escape attempt with 2 other inmates in the Atlanta penitentiary. They tried to escape unsuccessfully by using a makeshift rope, and when guards fired warning shots from their towers, the 3 men surrendered. Charles ended up being transferred to a Supermax, ADX Florence, in Colorado, where he actually didn't mind it. He stated in a letter to a friend that the silence was wonderful and there weren't enough hours in the day for his needs. Woody Harrelson would stay in contact with his father, visiting him about once a year until March 15, 2007, when Charles Harrelson was found dead in his cell of a heart attack at the age of 68. In the same year, 2007, the film No Country for Old Men was released 2 months after Charles Harrelson's death. His son, Woody Harrelson, had a role in the film. The author, Cormac McCarthy, who wrote the book the film was based on, said it in 1980. In the film, the sheriff makes reference to Woody's father when he says the line, "Here a while back in San Antonio, they shot and killed a federal judge." In conclusion, there's a lot that's really just not known about Charles, or at least that I couldn't find, particularly when it comes to his parents and his upbringing. But one thing that I did find helpful when looking into him, other than stimulant abuse, was reading the scans and photos of old newspaper clippings. They go into much more detail than any of the articles I read or the videos that I watched, all of which, by the way, will be linked. There are some things that I chose not to cover because I felt like they didn't fit the narrative of this video quite right. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask, and like I said, all my sources will be cited down in the description. That's really all I have for you about Charles. I hope you found his story as entertaining as I did. I need to go have a drink after numbing my brain with this nonsense for hours. I hope you guys enjoy your day.